The day her name was spoken with pity rather than respect, Eleanor Astrom understood that a life could fracture without a single blow. It happened in a drawing room thick with murmurs, where a careless remark about her father's debts fell like a verdict. No one addressed her directly, the silence itself was the cruelty. Eleanor had been raised to believe that dignity was armor enough, yet that morning it slipped, leaving her exposed to whispers she could not answer. Her prospects narrowed in a single hour, and the quiet future she imagined collapsed into uncertainty. When she left the house, rain found her first, as if the world itself had taken sides. She walked without direction, grief lending weight to each step, until a voice broke through her thoughts with an apology strained by pain. A stranger stood nearby, breath uneven, pride battling the obvious difficulty of remaining upright. He asked only for a moment, not charity, and the restraint in his tone surprised her. Eleanor should have passed on, for kindness carried risks when one possessed little else, yet something steadier than caution guided her. She offered her arm, careful and wordless, allowing him the dignity of acceptance. He thanked her with formality that felt out of place, as though habit clung even in distress. They spoke briefly, exchanging names without weight, and he claimed to be a retired officer laid low by an old wound. Eleanor listened without suspicion, for suffering had a sound she recognized. When they parted, he bowed with care, leaving her unsettled by gratitude that felt heavier than the rain. The days that followed offered no relief, only a summons delivered with curt politeness from a distant cousin attached to the royal household. Eleanor was to attend as a temporary companion, a role humble enough to escape scrutiny yet close enough to invite it. Need pressed harder than pride, and she accepted. At court, the language of judgment sharpened, and Eleanor felt her earlier disgrace trailing her like a rumor that breathed. She held herself with practiced restraint, observing more than she spoke, determined to leave no fresh mark for gossip. Yet restraint did not shield her from memory. As she waited one afternoon in an antechamber, pain flickered across a familiar voice behind her, steadying itself before speech. Recognition struck like a second misfortune, unwelcome and undeniable. She turned, already fearing the cruelty of coincidence. The man from the road stood transformed not in bearing but in circumstance, announced by titles that swallowed the room. A duke, spoken of with reverence, now framed by expectation rather than need. His limp remained, a quiet truth no ceremony could erase. Eleanor lowered her eyes too late, aware that he had recognized her as well. For an instant, the court dissolved, leaving only shared memory and the peril it carried. Protocol rushed back, colder than judgment. Introductions proceeded, indifferent to the storm they had ignited, and Eleanor answered when addressed, voice steady by necessity. The duke's gaze found her once, not with entitlement but with something like reckoning. She wondered which version of him would claim the truth. Later, alone with her thoughts, Eleanor felt the old shame twist into a sharper fear, for kindness had crossed a boundary she could not name. She had helped him when he was unguarded, and the memory now belonged to power. That imbalance unsettled her more than disgrace. Across the palace, the Duke wrestled with a different unease, recalling a moment when he had been seen without advantage. Her refusal to flatter him then returned as a rare mercy. He had not expected gratitude to follow him into rank. When evening brought renewed assembly, the air seemed to listen, as though waiting for a misstep. Eleanor sensed eyes measuring her worth, while his presence weighed upon her resolve. Neither spoke, yet silence tightened between them. A small courtesy broke the tension, his careful inquiry after her comfort, phrased so neutrally it could not offend. She replied with equal care, and in that measured exchange lay a fragile truce. Others noticed nothing, which was its own miracle. As the gathering dispersed, Eleanor felt the future narrow again, but now with a single bright uncertainty at its center. The kindness she offered in obscurity had bound her to consequence. She could not decide whether to regret it. The Duke watched her leave, aware that the court's eyes would soon sharpen, and that restraint would be tested. He had concealed his name to heal, not to deceive, yet fate had drawn a line regardless. Crossing it would cost them both. That night, whispers gathered strength, feeding on novelty, and Eleanor sensed her fragile standing begin to tremble. She slept little, rehearsing composure like a prayer. Memory returned to the road, to pain and politeness shared. Morning brought no answers, only a message requesting her presence again, unsigned yet unmistakable in authority. Her hand steadied as she prepared, choosing resolve over fear. Whatever followed would be faced awake. Somewhere beyond her hearing, the Duke dismissed counsel urging distance, his thoughts fixed on a promise he had never made. He intended only honesty, yet honesty itself was dangerous. The court would not forgive simplicity. Eleanor paused before answering the summons, feeling the weight of a choice forming without consent. She recalled his limp, unchanged by power, and the courtesy that had asked nothing. If virtue meant anything, it had begun there. With a breath that steadied her spine, she stepped forward, unaware that the smallest kindness had set a greater story in motion. Behind closed doors, a duke waited, no longer hidden, yet hoping to be seen. Between them lay the peril of truth. As footsteps approached, expectation tightened, and the first test of their fragile connection prepared to begin. Neither knew whether compassion would prove salvation or ruin. The answer waited just beyond the door. She lifted her hand to knock, and history seemed to hold its breath. Everything depended on truth. Boom, it came without warning, a sentence spoken too loudly in a drawing room where mercy had never been invited. The young gentlewoman stood accused not of crime, but of inconvenience, that most polite form of cruelty. Her name was spoken as though it were an error to be corrected, her presence a burden no one wished to carry through the season. A relative with a polished voice explained that opportunities were scarce, that expectations must be managed, that gratitude was the only appropriate response to being tolerated. The room listened, approving the economy of feeling. She lowered her eyes, because looking up invited further instruction. What hurt was not the decision itself, but the relief that followed once it was made. She was no longer a question for others to answer. She was dismissed. That evening she walked alone, counting her breath as if it were currency, each one spent with care, each one necessary. It was on that road, with her future reduced to the sound of her own steps, that she heard another pace uneven, hesitant, dragged by habit rather than choice. A man spoke her name without knowing it, asking for nothing but direction, forgiveness, time. She answered because silence would have been another kind of cruelty. His voice carried the weight of command that had learned restraint, and pain that had become methodical. He explained himself briefly, as men do when they fear explanation will invite judgment. An old injury, a journey misjudged, a body that no longer obeyed the will that directed it. She listened, and in listening offered something rarer than aid. She believed him without question. She guided him with words, paced herself to his need, and pretended not to notice when his breath failed. They parted without names, which felt like mercy at the time. Days passed as days do, each one adding weight to what could not be said. She accepted a summons because refusal would have confirmed every whisper already written about her. The palace required her service to a distant relation, a role defined by usefulness and silence. She prepared herself by forgetting what she had hoped for. Upon arrival, the air pressed with expectation she could hear in the careful pauses between voices. Names were announced like verdicts. When his was spoken, it landed within her like a blow that did not bruise the skin. Recognition arrived late, resisted, then absolute. He did not look at her at once. He waited, as if waiting were a discipline he trusted. When he did, his voice changed only enough to be true. He remembered the road. She remembered the lie she had told herself, that kindness was small. Whispers followed, not about them, but about order, about what must not be confused. He was a duke, and therefore a symbol before he was a man. She was an accommodation, and therefore a problem to be managed. Their first exchange was proper, which meant dangerous. He thanked her for the direction she had given, nothing more. She acknowledged the honor of his memory, nothing less. Between those phrases lived everything they could not admit. The court observed their distance and approved it as virtue. Yet later, alone with her charge, she felt the cost of that approval. To be seen as nothing was to be safe, and safety began to sound like another word for erasure. He sent a book, unremarkable in appearance, heavy with margin notes written in a hand she recognized. It was a gift that risked nothing and said too much. She read it slowly, as if haste might expose her. The notes asked questions about duty, about who was owed what, about the price of being useful. She answered none of them, but kept the book near. At a small gathering, someone laughed too freely about injured men and their vanity. The Duke said nothing. She did, quietly, and the room remembered her for it. Afterward, he thanked her again, this time for speaking when silence would have protected her. The distance between them narrowed by a fraction no one could measure. She understood the danger then. To be known by him was to invite scrutiny that did not forgive. Still, she found herself waiting for the sound of his uneven step, proof that the man on the road had not been imagined. Gossip arrived before sleep, soft as concern and sharp as instruction. She was advised to remember her place, as if place were a gift that could be withdrawn. He was advised to be careful with gratitude, as if gratitude were an indulgence. Neither accepted the advice fully, which made the court uneasy. A letter came from him, formal to the point of defiance, requesting her presence for a conversation under proper auspices. She read it twice, then once more for courage. If she declined, she would be safe. If she accepted, she would be honest. Honesty felt like another kind of risk she had never been taught to avoid. She went. Their meeting was brief, watched, and therefore charged. He spoke of the road as a place where truth traveled without escort. She answered that truth often arrived injured and unannounced. Nothing more was said, yet everything shifted. The court felt it and braced. That night, she dreamed of a door left unlatched, not opened, not closed, and woke with the knowledge that waiting had become a choice. Somewhere nearby, a step hesitated outside custom, outside command, and the palace held its breath as if listening for which rule would break. She understood then that their kindness had already become a challenge, and that the next move would belong to him, to whether he would remain a duke before he was a man, or step once more onto the road where names did not matter. She waited for the sound that would answer her heart, knowing that silence could no longer be mistaken for peace, and that whatever came next would. A scream of fate broke the quiet of her days, for rumor struck harder than any hand, and it named her foolish, forward, and forgettable. She learned this not from enemies, but from the tender mouths of friends who spoke with pity polished to civility. The palace had noticed her too closely, they said, and notice was a dangerous flame for a woman without fortune. Thus tragedy began as a whisper that stole her sleep and pressed upon her chest like a borrowed sin. She had believed kindness to be invisible. She had believed that the small mercy offered upon a wet road could vanish like breath in cold air. Instead it returned multiplied, dressed in consequence. Invitations arrived edged with courtesy yet weighted with command, and she felt herself summoned not as a guest but as an example. In the anterooms of power, stories grew legs and ran. Some claimed she had schemed, others said she had trapped a noble heart with peasant tears. She stood between these inventions, silent, absorbing blame she did not recognize. When she next encountered him, it was not upon the road of shared humanity but within the disciplined hush of court. He bowed with the exactitude of rank, not the ease of gratitude. The limping stranger was gone, replaced by a duke whose name traveled ahead of him like thunder. Yet his eyes, steady and gray, remembered. In them she saw apology restrained by law and something warmer held in check by pride. Their greeting lasted seconds and carried years. The tragedy deepened because restraint was required of them both. She was advised, gently and repeatedly, to be grateful and distant. Gratitude was the acceptable mask for women who survived attention. Distance was the armor that kept reputations intact. He, too, was counseled, urged to correct impressions, to let her fade politely. The injury that had bent his step had also sharpened his patience, and patience now became his torment. They met only as ceremony demanded. Words were weighed, glances rationed. Yet absence grew louder than presence. Each learned the other's discipline through the ache of not breaking it. She practiced humility like a prayer, kneeling inwardly whenever her name was spoken. He practiced indifference until it bruised him. Society applauded their good sense while secretly feeding on the tension it had created. A turn came when an accusation reached the Duke's ear, carried by a voice that enjoyed its own cleverness. It suggested that her charity on the road had been rehearsed, that she trafficked in calculated innocence. The old wound flared then, not in bone but in honor. He remembered Rain, remembered her hand steady despite fear, remembered how she had not asked his name. The past contradicted the present lie. He sought her not in secret, but with the openness of daylight. This itself became scandal. Their conversation was brief, measured, and devastating in its sincerity. He asked whether she regretted helping him. She answered that regret belonged to those who bargain kindness. The simplicity of her reply stripped the air of pretense. In that moment, something irreversible aligned between them. Yet tragedy insisted upon its due. Her distant relative, whose patronage had brought her near the palace, withdrew support. Doors closed without sound. She was informed that her usefulness had expired. To remain would be to invite harsher judgments. To leave would be to accept the narrative written for her. She chose departure with a dignity that felt like defeat. The Duke learned of this as one learns of death, too late to intervene without consequence. Protocol stood like a wall between impulse and action. He walked its length and found no opening. His silence, meant to protect her, became the final wound. She left without farewell, carrying with her the certainty that compassion, once seen, could not be unseen. Time stretched in uneasy intervals. Letters were written for her by others, cautious and polite, offering small positions far from notice, each framed as mercy. She declined them with thanks that tasted of iron. Memory returned in fragments, the sound of his cane upon stone, the pause before his bow, the restraint that had felt like respect. She wondered if restraint could also be fear. Meanwhile he confronted counsels, not to plead, but to listen, measuring the weight of every consequence. Advisers spoke of alliances, of expectations, of healing reputations. None spoke of truth. He realized then that truth had no champion unless he became one. The injury that had once confined his body now disciplined his courage. He practiced saying her name aloud when alone, testing how it altered the room. Each time, resolve gathered like weather. Outside his chamber, the world continued its rituals, unaware that a decision was forming, slow and dangerous. Within hers, she rehearsed independence, unaware that her absence had already become an argument impossible to silence. Fate listened, patient, sharpening its unanswered question. In the wake of her absence, the palace seemed to him an echoing shell. He understood then that power was loud and intimacy quiet, and that he had confused the two. He drafted a letter he did not send, paced rooms that no longer steadied him, and recognized the true cost of concealment. What he had hidden to heal himself had endangered another. Her journey away was marked by a single resolve, to remain herself even if misjudged. Shame traveled with her, but it did not command her. She had been changed by recognition, not corrupted by it. The road opened again, uncertain yet honest. Somewhere behind her, a man of rank wrestled with a truth that refused to be obedient. The boom that began in rumor settled into a waiting silence. Between them lay distance, duty, and a question that neither could answer alone. Whether the Duke would defy the architecture of his world, or whether she would be allowed to return without surrender, hovered unresolved. Fate, having struck once, lifted its hand again, preparing either mercy or ruin. Boom, the word of censure fell like a gunshot through her name, and with it came the memory of loss she had buried. The summons was not gentle, it carried disgrace, whispers, and the echo of her father's ruin. She felt again the night when fortune collapsed, when loyalty proved thin, and when survival demanded silence. This moment returned that wound, sharper, insisting she answer for kindness mistaken as presumption. Duty pressed her forward, though her pulse rebelled. Somewhere nearby, steps faltered, reminding her that mercy, once given, never remains without consequence. Today would decide whether humility still possessed a place. She was commanded to speak, yet the air itself seemed to judge her tone. Courtiers murmured of boundaries crossed, of a duke's patience tested, of charity mistaken for ambition. She answered with restraint, refusing defense beyond truth, stating only that aid had been offered to a stranger in pain. Each syllable cost her pride. The Duke listened in silence, bearing the weight of authority and memory together. His injury throbbed, not of body but of conscience, as her voice recalled the road where names had been unnecessary. Respect shifted quietly, unsettling the rules everyone pretended to revere without compromise assumed. He spoke at last, and the court stilled, surprised by gentleness in command. He admitted the deception plainly, claiming necessity, not sport, had hidden his title. War had taken steadiness from his limb, pride from his voice, and sleep from his nights. On the road, he had sought nothing but anonymity. He declared her conduct beyond reproach, condemning those who sought shame. Yet restraint bound him, gratitude could not yet become affection, nor justice become invitation, without tearing open the fabric he was sworn to guard. The admission steadied her while sharpening the peril before them in shared silence together. Whispers swelled despite his defense, insisting mercy invites presumption when ranks are unequal. She felt the familiar burn of being measured and found wanting. He sensed it too, recognizing the cruelty he had escaped by birth. Against counsel, he requested a private word, not as command but courtesy. Protocol allowed refusal, courage demanded acceptance. Alone in spirit, though never truly alone, they faced the question hovering between breath and thought: could honor survive desire, or must one be sacrificed to preserve the other? Her answer waited, trembling, shaped by years of restraint and learned patience under scrutiny from unforgiving society. She spoke carefully, choosing truth without claim. She reminded him that kindness expects nothing, that gratitude need not promise futures it cannot keep. Her voice did not accuse, it steadied him. He answered with equal care, confessing admiration rooted in character, not circumstance. He vowed protection of her good name, even at cost to his comfort. The words did not bind hearts, yet they shifted ground. A path appeared, narrow and conditional, marked by patience, correspondence, and distance imposed by rank. Such terms felt both mercy and trial, hope balanced against caution within unyielding customs that governed their lives strictly. Consequences followed swiftly. Invitations cooled, allies recalculated, and her position wavered. He bore reprimand disguised as advice, urged to remember lineage over inclination. Yet he persisted, arranging respectable distance while ensuring her safety. Letters, measured and infrequent, carried reflection rather than fire. In them, he asked after her resolve, she answered with dignity, never pleading. The scandal dulled, replaced by watchful waiting. What had begun as rumor matured into test, pressing whether constancy could endure when spectacle withdrew its attention. Silence became their tutor, demanding patience neither had practiced before under inherited expectations and public scrutiny that weighed heavily daily. Her family urged retreat, fearing permanent damage. She refused bitterness, choosing steadiness instead. He weighed renunciation against responsibility, haunted by examples of indulgence punished by history. When illness revisited his injury, he did not summon her, restraint proved his regard. She sent no message, honoring boundaries that protected them both. In absence, affection clarified itself, shedding urgency and acquiring purpose. Love, unnamed, grew ethical. It asked not possession, but worthiness, and whether sacrifice could be shared rather than demanded. This realization steadied her even as uncertainty lingered over futures constrained by titles and duty yet warmed by mutual respect alone. The court noticed the change, mistaking restraint for defeat. He corrected nothing. She continued service with quiet excellence. When finally summoned again, the tone was altered, cautious rather than condemning. He spoke of timelines, of patience honored, of intentions submitted to counsel. She listened without illusion, grateful for honesty unadorned. Agreement formed, fragile but real, a season of waiting, after which choice would be declared publicly. The promise contained risk, yet it restored agency stolen by rumor. Her consent came measured, recognizing freedom within limits and valuing dignity over reckless triumph before society's relentless gaze returned to test them both. Yet tragedy returned without warning. A charge of impropriety resurfaced, weaponized by rivals, threatening exile from favor. She was urged to deny knowing him at all. He was advised to abandon the arrangement to preserve peace. Old wounds reopened, demanding a decision sooner than planned. In private, words were few and heavy. He asked whether she would stand if he did. She answered with courage learned from hardship, stating she would not trade truth for shelter again. Her resolve startled him, clarifying the cost he must accept to proceed with honor intact despite the storm gathering around their fragile accord. He chose then, not with spectacle, but with fidelity to conscience. He would present the truth formally, accept censure if necessary, and ask for time publicly, not indulgence. She agreed, knowing the risk could cost her place. As they parted, no promises were spoken, yet commitment had been forged. The future narrowed to a single hinge. When the announcement was scheduled, whispers sharpened. The question lingered, unanswered and electric: would integrity be rewarded, or would the world punish them for daring to choose it? Her breath held, awaiting judgment beyond mercy or rank that would decide everything very soon indeed. Boom! The grand clock in the palace hall struck the hour with a resonant toll, echoing through the vaulted ceilings like a proclamation of fate. Eleanor stood near the marble balustrade, her gloved hands clutching the rail as though it might anchor her heart against the storm raging within. The evening light, gilded and fragile, streamed through the arched windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced like memory fragments in the air. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, yet every thought scattered like autumn leaves the moment the Duke appeared. He did not announce himself, he simply emerged from the shadowed corridor with that calm, measured grace that had once seemed so unassuming on the rain-slicked road. Now, every movement carried the authority of his station, yet in his eyes, she recognized the same gentle vulnerability he had revealed when she had offered him help, believing him to be a mere traveler. Her breath hitched as he approached, each step deliberate and unhurried, the polished boots whispering over the cold marble floor. The hum of the palace servants faded into silence around them. It was as if the world had contracted to the space between their eyes. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low cadence of warmth and restraint, "I had hoped I might see you again under kinder circumstances." The words, simple in construction, carried a weight that made her chest tighten. It was not his station she feared, she had faced society's judgment before, but the vulnerability of being seen as herself, wholly and without pretense, was a terror she had learned to suppress. He extended a hand, not in command but in invitation. She hesitated, her pulse a staccato in her ears, before allowing her fingers to rest lightly against his. The contact was fleeting, yet it ignited a flicker of recognition deeper than memory, the night rain, the limp, the quiet gratitude in his eyes, all compressed into a single moment that now stretched infinitely between them. "You showed me kindness when you believed I was of no account," he murmured, "and yet that kindness revealed the worth I had long sought, yet could not find in courtly assemblies or grand estates." Eleanor's throat constricted. No one had ever articulated the intangible so precisely, that her compassion, her simple act of humanity, had been a bridge over the chasm of privilege that separated them. The Duke guided her to a set of high-backed chairs near a flickering hearth, the flames casting long shadows that danced across the gilded walls. Each movement was a choreography of restraint. He did not touch her again, yet his proximity was a silent insistence of presence. Eleanor sank into the chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her fingers twitched with unspent tension. "I confess," he began, his gaze dropping to the fire before returning to meet hers, "that these days have been a torment of propriety. Every glance I give must be measured against expectation, every word weighed against the unforgiving scales of gossip. And yet?" His pause hung between them, pregnant with meaning. "And yet, I find my thoughts persistently drawn to you." Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Words were inadequate, she had rehearsed them and found them wanting. The Duke, perceiving her struggle, inclined his head ever so slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement and patience. "It is not beauty alone that commands my attention," he said softly, "nor the elegance demanded by society. It is your virtue, Eleanor, the quiet courage in your decisions, the grace with which you treat the world's suffering, that compels my heart in ways I scarcely comprehend." The warmth of his gaze, tempered with dignity, seemed to encircle her, shielding her from the judgmental eyes that lurked in the gilded corridors of their reality. Outside the hearthlight, the palace wall seemed to recede, leaving only the truth of their connection. Eleanor felt the years of constraint, of carefully measured smiles and silent endurance, peel away like layers of fragile silk. Here, in this suspended moment, she was not a gentlewoman to be judged for her family, nor a companion to be measured for her utility. She was simply Eleanor, and that simplicity, that essence, was the very thing that had captured the Duke from the first rain-soaked evening. A tremor of relief coursed through her, hope, fragile yet unyielding, flickered in her chest. "I must speak plainly," he continued, leaning forward just enough to close the space of formality without breaching it entirely. "I am bound by duty, by title, and by expectation. But I find that these chains cannot contain the truth I feel. I have observed your integrity, your compassion, and in every private moment of reflection, I am drawn to it, to you. Would you permit me, despite the scrutiny of society, to pursue what my heart dictates?" His words, though softly spoken, were a defiance against the rigid architecture of rank and reputation. Eleanor, her heart quaking, recognized the courage required to voice such sentiments within these walls, and she understood that courage mirrored her own. A silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but anticipatory. She allowed herself a single, measured breath, drawing strength from the sincerity in his gaze. "If we are to defy expectation," she said finally, "let it be together. I do not pretend that the world will acquiesce easily, but I will meet it with you, as I met you that night in the rain, without pretense, without artifice." The Duke's expression softened, a rare and luminous smile gracing the rigid lines of his countenance. In that smile was the promise of alliance, of mutual recognition of worth beyond titles and inheritance. He extended his hand again, this time not as an offer but as a pledge. Eleanor took it, her fingers curling around his with a mixture of trepidation and certainty. The warmth of his grasp grounded her, and she felt, for the first time, that the precarious scaffolding of society could be navigated together. No words could capture the quiet triumph of two souls acknowledging one another across the chasm of rank and expectation, yet the look they exchanged was enough, a silent pact of hearts committed, fragile yet steadfast. From the corridors, the distant murmur of servants and the faint echo of music from the upcoming ball reminded them that the world awaited their compliance, their conformity. But for now, the palace hall had shrunk to the dimensions of possibility, illuminated by firelight and unspoken truth. The Duke leaned closer, his forehead almost brushing hers, and whispered, "We will face it all, Eleanor. Together." The simplicity of the phrase carried more gravity than the most ornate declaration of love ever written in courtly chronicles. A sudden chime from the palace bell tower punctuated the intimacy, a reminder that time, and with its scrutiny, would resume its relentless course. Yet Eleanor felt unshakable, anchored by the knowledge that the man beside her, the Duke, the once limping stranger, chose to see her, truly, above all else. In that choice lay freedom, courage, and the quiet revolution of hearts unbound by title or expectation. Outside the window, night had fallen fully, draping the palace in a velvet shroud, and the first stars began to punctuate the sky. Eleanor lifted her gaze to them, imagining that each twinkle might mirror the nascent hope blossoming within her chest. The Duke followed her sight, and their eyes met again, a shared understanding passing between them that neither society nor circumstance could unweave the threads now woven so deliberately. Yet, even in the cocoon of firelight and whispered declarations, a soft tension lingered, a reminder that the world beyond these walls remained governed by eyes eager for scandal and tongues poised for rumor. Eleanor drew in a steadying breath, feeling both the thrill of intimacy and the weight of reality. And in that precise moment, as if fate itself had paused to witness the fragile courage of their confession, a distant knock echoed through the hall, subtle yet insistent, heralding news that might test the fortitude of their newfound accord. The Duke's hand tightened around hers, an unspoken promise that, whatever the world demanded, they would confront it side by side, hearts entwined in defiance and devotion.